Friction question answers. What does friction do to soles of our shoes? Friction causes wear and tear in soles of our shoes. Why does a matchstick catch fire when it is rubbed on a rough surface? Matchstick catches fire due to friction. What happens when there is no friction between the chalk and the blackboard? We cannot write if there is no friction between chalk and the blackboard. What would happen when an object starts moving if there is no friction? The object would never stop if there is no friction. What does friction produce? Friction produces heat. Write one harm of friction. Friction wears out the materials like machine parts. Why does jar of a mixer become hot when it is run for few minutes? The jar of a mixer becomes hot due to friction. Why do the tires of cars and trucks treaded? The treaded tires of cars and trucks provide better grip with the ground. Why do kabaddi players rub their hands with soil? Kabaddi players rub their hands with soil for a better grip of their opponents. Give two examples where friction is undesirable. We sprinkle fine powder on carom board to reduce friction. Drops of oil are poured on the hinges of doors so that the door moves smoothly. What do you mean by lubricants? The substances which are used to reduce friction are called lubricants. Why are oil, creams, and grease called lubricants? Oil, creams, and grease are called lubricants because they are used to reduce friction. How are the shoes made to counter the friction and make better grip? The shoes have grooves on their soles. What is used in cycle brakes to increase friction? Brake pads are used in cycle brakes to increase the friction. Name the substance which is used in carom board to reduce friction. Talcum powder is used in carom board to reduce friction. What is avoided between two surfaces to make movement smooth? Interlocking of irregularities is avoided between two surfaces to make movement smooth. Can we eliminate friction completely? No, we cannot eliminate friction completely. What is used to reduce friction in machines where lubricants are not advisable? Air cushions are used to reduce friction in machines where lubrication is not advisable. Why do pieces of luggage fitted with rollers? The pieces of luggage are fitted with rollers to reduce single friction so that children can pull such piece of luggage easily. Name two methods of reducing friction. By rolling or by sliding, one can reduce friction. How sliding friction is replaced by rolling in machine. By use of ball bearings, sliding friction is replaced by rolling friction in case of machines. Name any machine in which ball bearing is used to reduce friction. Ceiling fan is an example in which ball bearing is used to reduce friction. What is a drag? The frictional force exerted by fluid is called drag. What are fluids? Commonly, gases and liquids are called as fluids. What does frictional force exerted on an object in a fluid depend on? Friction depends on the speed with respect to the fluid and the nature of fluid. Name the special shape given to objects moving in fluid. The special shape which is given to objects moving in fluid is called a streamline shape. Name some objects which have streamlined body. Boats, aeroplanes, and ships have streamlined body. When does rolling friction come into play? When a body rolls on other body, then rolling friction comes into play. Give examples of two lubricants. Grease and oils are examples of two lubricants. Why are lubricants used? Lubricants are used to prevent the parts of machines from developing friction. Why do kabaddi players rub their hands with soil? Kabaddi players rub their hands with soil for a better grip of their opponents. Write two factors on which friction depends. The friction depends on shape of object and nature of object. What is the cause of friction? Friction is caused by irregularities on two surfaces in contact. The irregularities on the two surfaces lock into one another. Due to the interlocking, the two surfaces friction arises. Push the book on a table. You observe that after some time it stops. Explain why. When we push a book on a table, then a force acts on book which opposes its motion. This force is called force of friction. The friction opposes the movement due to which the book stops. What is a spring balance? Spring balance is a device used for measuring the force acting on an object. It contains a coiled spring. The spring gets stretched when a force is applied on it. Stretching of the spring is measured by a pointer moving on a graduated scale. The reading on the scale gives the magnitude of force. How does the friction get affected by the nature of surface? Nature of surface is the major factor which affects the friction. When we attempt to move any surface, we have to apply a force to overcome the interlocking of the surfaces. On rough surfaces, there are a larger number of irregularities. So, the force of friction is greater if a rough surface is involved. Take two bricks. One is wrapped in jute while other is wrapped in polythene. Which one will be easier to drag and why? It is easier to drag the brick which is wrapped in polythene. Polythene has a smooth surface. It has less friction than the jute, thus it requires lesser force to drag it. Jute has rough surface so it needs more force to drag it. Why is it easy to drag a mat from the floor, but it is difficult to drag the mat when somebody is sitting on it? We know that friction is caused by the interlocking of the irregularities in two surfaces. It is obvious that the force of friction will increase if the two surfaces are pressed harder. So it is easy to drag a mat when nobody is sitting on it, but when a person is sitting on it, then it produces more friction and not easy to drag it. What are static and sliding frictions? The force required to overcome friction at the instant an object starts moving from rest is a measure of static friction. On the other hand, the force required to keep the object moving with the same speed is a measure of sliding friction. Which is smaller, static friction or sliding friction, and why? When the object starts sliding, the object points on its surface the contact points on its surface do not get enough time to lock into the contact points on the floor. So the sliding friction is slightly smaller than the static friction. What happens if the floor we walk on is frictionless? We would not be able to walk on the surface if there is no friction on the floor. It is the friction which helps us to stand or walk on the surface. The grooves of our feet or shoes are locked into the irregularities of the floor and make us stand. Why is it not easy to move an object from its static position? When an object is at rest, it has better hold of the surface on which it is placed. In the static position, the irregularities of the surface are interlocked properly, due to which more force is required to overcome the friction. So, it is not easy to move an object from its static position. Why can't we write with a chalk if there were no friction? We cannot write with a chalk, pen, pencil if there were no friction. If we are writing with a chalk on frictionless surface, then no chalk particles stick to the surface. So we cannot write with a chalk if there were no friction. On the other hand, when we are writing with a chalk on the blackboard, its rough surface rubs off some chalk particles which stick to the blackboard. The soles of our shoes get worn out after a period of time. Explain why. The soles of our shoes get worn out after a period of time due to friction. When we walk on the road, then the friction arises. Our shoes have to overcome friction to walk, due to which our shoes get worn out slowly. Our hands become warm when we rub them. Why? When we rub our hands with each other, the friction arises between two hands. The friction produces heat. This heat makes our hands warm. This is why our hands become warm when we rub them. We can feel this warmth by touching our hands on our face. Mention three examples which show that the friction produces heat. Some examples which show that friction produces heat are following: warming of our palms when we rub them, jar of a mixture becomes hot when it is run, warming of the parts of a machine when it is operated. We observe that in some cases we want to increase friction. Explain why. If we do not increase friction, vehicles will slip on the roads and they will never stop. We need to increase friction for better grip and to control the speed of the moving objects. It is not easy to walk and ride without friction. We increase friction by making roads with concrete and by applying brakes in vehicles to stop them. Why do we need to decrease friction and how it can be decreased? Friction is harmful in some of the cases. It causes a lot of wear and tear in objects. It also causes damage to the machine parts. So we need to decrease the friction. It can be decreased by rolling, sliding, and lubricating the surface in contact. We use ball bearings, wheels, and lubricants like grease, oils, and creams to decrease the friction. How do wheels reduce friction? We use wheels to reduce friction. The wheels reduce the resistance against motion, so it is easy to roll the body over one another than to slide a body. That is the reason that wheels reduce friction. What are the factors on which frictional force depends in fluids? There are following factors on which force of friction depends in fluids. The frictional force on an object in a fluid depends on its speed with respect to the fluid. Frictional force also depends on the shape of the object and the nature of the fluid. Why do we shape aeroplane like that of a bird? The objects are given special shape to minimize friction. Aeroplane and birds both fly in the air and have to face friction exerted by air. They are so shaped that they do not have to lose energy while overcoming the frictional force exerted by air to fly. Therefore, the aeroplanes are also shaped streamlined so that they can overcome the frictional force of air. Explain the advantages and the disadvantages of friction. Advantages of friction. We cannot write with a pen or pencil if there were no friction. We cannot write on the blackboard with a chalk if there were no friction. If an object started moving, it would never stop if there were no friction. We cannot walk on the road without friction. We cannot fix a nail on the wall or tie a knot without friction. Disadvantages. It wears out the materials, whether they are screws, ball bearings, or soles of shoes. It causes damage to the parts of machines. Friction also produces heat. When machine is operated, heat is generated that causes wastage of energy. The tires of cars, buses, and trucks, etc., also worn out due to friction. Friction reduces the speed due to which more force is required. In this way, we see that friction is harmful as well as useful, so it is called necessary evil. Write some methods used to reduce friction. Methods to reduce friction: by using fine powder on the surface like on carom board, by using oils in the tools or in machine parts, by using grease between the moving parts of a machine, by using graphite powder between moving parts of a machine, by using air cushion between the moving parts in some machines where oils or lubricants may not be advisable. Explain various types of frictions. The types of frictions are static friction, sliding friction, and rolling friction. Static friction: the friction which is produced between two surfaces in contact with each other at the position of rest is called static friction. This type of friction is more powerful than others. It is not easy to overcome the static friction. This type of friction needs a lot of energy to overcome. Sliding friction: the friction which arises when two objects in contact are in motion is called sliding friction. It is lesser than static friction but more than rolling friction. In this type of friction, irregularities of surfaces do not get enough time to lock with each other as objects are already in motion. Rolling friction: the friction which arises when two bodies are rolling on each other is called rolling friction. Rolling movements of both objects do not allow the locking of irregularities, so it is the smallest friction out of three types of frictions. What is fluid friction? Write the factors on which fluid friction depends. The gases and liquids are called fluids. The friction exerted by fluids on an object is called fluid friction. The fluid friction is also called drag. The factors on which the fluid friction depends are as follows. The fluid friction of an object depends on its speed with respect to fluid. The fluid friction of an object also depends on the shape of the object. The frictional force due to fluids also depends on the nature of the fluid. Fill in the blanks. The friction always opposes the direction of motion. Friction also produces heat. All objects moving in fluids have streamlined shape to reduce friction. Smooth surfaces produce lesser friction. The substances which are used in machines to protect their surfaces from wear and tear caused by friction are called lubricants. An air cushion between the moving parts is used to reduce friction. Friction can never be entirely eliminated. Birds and fishes have streamlined shaped body. We pour a drop of oil on the hinges of door to reduce friction. The force of friction is different for different surfaces. Match the following: lubricants, oil and grease. Friction produces heat. Wheels produce rolling friction. Ball bearings are present in ceiling fan. Soapy floor has less friction. Spring balance is a measuring force. Lubricants reduce friction. Fluid friction is also called as drag. Shape of aeroplane is that of like a bird. Friction is dependent on nature of surface. True or false? Friction always works in opposite direction of motion of the surface. True. Irregularities between two surfaces interlock to produce friction. True. Friction increases with increase in the smoothness of the surface. False. Soapy floor is slippery due to increased friction. False. Friction is a necessary evil. True. Spring balance is a device used for measuring the force. True. Sportsmen use shoes with spikes to increase the friction. True. Smooth surface has less frictional force. True. Fluids are only liquids. False. Friction is always harmful for us. False. Observe the figure. In one part it has no cloth on the table, while in another part it has cloth on it. Now answer the questions. In which case the pencil cell covers more distance? Give the reason of covering different distances in both cases. In case where the table is not covered by clothes, the pencil cells, when they slide, they cover more distance than in case where the table is covered by a cloth. When the table is not covered by a cloth, there is less friction due to smooth surface, while when the table is covered by cloth, the cloth makes the surface rough, due to which more frictional force is exerted. Observe the figure and answer the questions. Why do soles of shoes wear out? Can it be possible to reduce friction up to zero? The soles of shoes wear out due to friction. It is not possible to reduce friction up to zero. How many types of frictions are there? In which type of friction the force of friction is less? There are three types of friction: static friction, sliding friction, rolling friction. Out of these three types, rolling friction is smallest because the rolling decreases the friction. Identify the similarities between the bird and the aeroplane. Both aeroplane and bird fly in the air. Both have a specific shape to reduce friction. The name of the specific shape is streamlined shape. Write the function of ball bearings. What type of friction is this? The ball bearings are used to reduce friction, and it is a rolling type of friction. What is spring balance? What does spring balance measure? The spring balance measures the magnitude of the force. Why we fall down when we stop on a banana peel? The banana peel reduces friction between feet and the road. In which direction frictional force acts on a moving object? Frictional force acts in opposite direction of a moving object. Is the friction same for all the surfaces? No, it depends on the roughness, smoothness of the surfaces. Which frictional force is smaller, sliding or static? Sliding friction is slightly smaller than the static friction. What is easier, rolling or sliding? Rolling is easier than sliding due to less frictional force. Why the surface of a matchbox should be rough? By striking a matchstick on a rough surface, it produces fire by friction, so it should be rough. Why do we use lubricants between the moving parts of a machine? The lubricants are used to reduce friction between the moving parts of the machine. What is a drag? The frictional force exerted by fluids is called drag. What is the shape of an aeroplane, a bird or a fish? The shape of aeroplane, bird or a fish is streamlined shape.